Hello, welcome to the Polyglot Engineer channel. I want to talk tonight about async and await and promises and how those are interchangeable inside of JavaScript. This kind of came up the other night in a user group meeting I was attending for React, and so I think there was some confusion from some of the people about promises and how those relate to sync and await, and to kind of understand basically what those are doing, you really have to understand, one of the advantages of JavaScript. So just see an example here of what I'm talking about. If we look at this right here, we can see a simple Express app, which is just taking a route. And there's actually a higher order function for setting up this route. So what we're actually doing here is we're passing in a function into this function call. And the reason why we're doing that is because one of the things that you can do with JavaScript, you've always been able to do with JavaScript, is this idea of callbacks, in the sense that callbacks allow you to do things asynchronously. So what does that mean? That means that, let's say we're going to make a network request, and maybe the server that we're calling is really slow. We want to block other things that we're trying to do while we're waiting for a response to come back. And so the JavaScript engine V8 and Node, as an example, one of the things that it'll do is it actually runs inside of a run loop. And what it'll do is, if you're making, let's say, a network request, as an example, it will say, hey, I'm going to make this a request to this server, but I don't want to hang up while we're waiting for a response from the server. So what will happen is it'll go and try to process and do other things while it's waiting for that response to come back from the server. And then once it does come back from the server, then it can handle that. And traditionally, the original way that we've always been able to handle that in JavaScript is with callbacks, right? So if we look right here, this right here is a callback for this route. So when somebody passes in essentially an empty route here, it's going to use this function to process that. And we can also use arrow functions to do that as well. So if I come over here, I can change this to an arrow function, and it works essentially the same way. So one of the changes that came back a number of years ago was this idea of being able to do promises. And so with promises, what you can do is think of it as like being like a future, where you say, okay, I have this thing that I want to do or I want to process, almost like a task. And what will happen is you can process that task, but then there's special methods that we can use for handling that as it's coming back. So just to give a quick example here. So let's say we want to go and create a function, and this function is going to return something. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to say create a worker, and I'm going to set this equal to an arrow function. And now what I want to do is I want to actually return something, but I want to return it as a promise. So what I can do is I can say return new promise. And this actually takes it's another example of a higher order function. What I can do is I can actually pass in another function to this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say we're going to have a function that takes resolve and reject. And then inside of here, what we can do is we can actually do our work here. And we may have something that may take some time. So just to kind of give an example of something that might take some time, I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to paste in this code that I wrote. And what this is doing is this has a little timeout here that says we're going to create this timer. And then once this is finished, let's say it takes 1,000 milliseconds, we're going to pass in this string here into resolve. And then if there's an error, then we can do reject. And so now if we want to use this, what we can do is we can say, I want to create a worker. And we create that worker by calling this function. So I'm going to say create worker. And now I have this worker. And now that I have the worker, there's two methods that you can use off of that in order to process this. So I can say worker and .then, and this takes a higher order function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I'm going to pass the result in here. And in that result, I'm just going to print that out. So I'm going to do the console.log, and we'll say result. And then if there's an error, I can say .catch. And we'll just pass that error in there. And then if there's an error, we'll print out the error. So I'll say console.error. There we go. So now if I try to go and run this, I can say node index. And now we can see that it took about a second to run, but our work has been completed. And this is great if you need to be able to create a promise, but there's a lot of different libraries and things that are already built inside of Node using promises. So just as an example here, this is the fetch API. And so the fetch API here, what we're doing here is we are going out and we're calling this this API call, which is returning back a JSON response. And the way the fetch API works is that you have a then that you can call, and then it's going to return back a response. And then in the response, we may want just the JSON data. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to return that JSON, but the JSON is another promise. And so we call .then again once we get that second promise, and now we can process that. So now if I come over here and I say node REST client, and now we get our result back here. So that's fine, but really what we've done is instead of using a traditional callback or an error first callback that you'd see in Node, what we're doing is we're now using a promise which also is using callbacks. And so a number of years ago, there was this idea that came out in a couple of different languages. C# was the first one I remember, of this notion of async and await. And so what async and await does is you can actually annotate your functions with an async keyword, and what that'll do is essentially it'll take that function and it'll turn it into a promise. And then for anything that you'd have to wait on, like for instance like a network callback as an example, you can use the wait keyword, and that essentially lets the compiler know in V8 that this is where we're waiting for it, and we don't have to worry about blocking other things that may be going on inside of our application. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this real quickly, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's do this. Let's say const, we'll say result is going to be equal to, and in this case I'm going to say fetch, and in the fetch I'm going to pass in this API URL, right? And if I try to run this right now, we'll get an error. But what I can do is I can come over here and I can say await. And if you're running Node 15 or later, you can actually get away with doing this. But I'm running Node 14, which is the current LTS release of Node. So in order for this to work, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to put this inside of a sync function. So I'm just going to create an anonymous async function to process this. And the way you can do that is you can say sync function, and in here what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this call and pass that in here, and I'm going to make this an immediate execution. This is an example there. And this will give us back a result. But as you remember before, we had to do a second then to get the to actually get the JSON back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say const JSON is going to be equal to await result.json. And now I'm going to do a console.log with that JSON data. And let's try running that and see what happens. Oops. And we can see that works just the same. And this syntax, I think, is a lot easier to read than using a traditional promise syntax. But the thing that's important to remember here is that this is interchangeable. That fetch essentially is a promise, but we're able to essentially just use async and await, the await keyword, to await what would be normally coming back from the .then. And so this is extremely handy when you're trying to write asynchronous code inside of JavaScript. So if you have any questions, please leave questions down in the comments. And once again, if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you don't, you can give it a thumbs down, but please give it a thumbs up. And please subscribe to the channel. Thanks, and have a good evening.